Iowa Public Television can help you
create it,
connect it,
drive
maintain it,
preserve it,
dance it,
sing it,
mold it,
say it,
cook it,
fry it,
stir it,
taste it,
face it,
dig it,
do it,
TV worth watching,
see it,
build it,
make it,
nail it,
play it,
learn it,
fly it,
where else can you find it,
invest it,
investigate
collect it,
sew it,
paint it,
experience
enjoy it.
It's television that makes a difference.
Understand
Discover it,
believe
become
it,
it,
think it,
solve
you
it.
need it,
Get it?
don't turn
You
it,
deserve it.
watch it. Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of other things, and we're going to talk of them in Alaska, where the wildlife flourished till Russian hunters moved in, and in California, where the first settlers found paradise and replaced it. This is George Page. Join me for the breathtaking beauty of our final frontiers and land of the eagle, a nature special presentation.
And continue our look at Iowa tonight at 8.
That's the question that we have to explore, really. Do I hate my brother because he reminds me of myself? Or do I hate my brother because he reminds me of someone who is not myself? So whom do I hate? The one who is me, or the one who is anything but me?
I'm Bill Moyers. Join me for Facing Hate, a conversation with Elie Wiesel.
See this special program this evening at 7.
You're watching Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching, IPTV.
Where available, MacNeil Lehrer Newshour can be heard with Spanish translation by using the second audio program channel on your stereo TV or stereo VCR. Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And the Iowa broadcast is made possible by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer Newshour.
Good evening. Leading the news this Wednesday, in a rush to adjourn, the Congress passed highway and banking bills. The U.S. and Britain demanded Libya surrender 2 officials indicted for the Pan Am bombing. The U.S. rejected a call by Israel to delay the next round of Mideast talks. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, we look at another last-minute issue before Congress, what to do to help the troubled banks of America. Paul SOLMAN has a backgrounder, followed by the opinions of a top administration official, a congressman, a banker, and a professor of banking. Then Gergen and Shields make a rare midweek appearance to dissect the disorder in Washington these last few days. We have an update report from Cambodia, and we close with a Clarence Page essay about a museum in Memphis.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo. And by AT&T. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you.
Congress broke for Thanksgiving tonight after a day of breakneck lawmaking. It passed a $151 billion transportation bill, a $95 billion bill for the bank and savings and loan insurance funds, a $500 million Soviet aid package to dismantle the Soviet nuclear arsenal and provide food for winter, an emergency bill providing nearly $2 billion to U.S. farmers and other Americans who have been victims of natural disasters. What it did not do was pass the omnibus crime bill. It died in the Senate after passing the House this morning by only 2 votes. After the day was over, leaders of both parties assessed what happened.
The work of this Congress, I think, has been impressive in enacting and passing in the House the important elements of our agenda. All of the important elements of our agenda were passed by the House. And so I'm very satisfied with the results here, and I think they speak to our concern about the economic condition of Americans. They are responsive to those concerns, and they reflect not only the view of the House of Representatives, but the central agenda of the Democratic Party.
I think our efforts certainly on the Civil Rights Bill, on a tough crime bill that was then weakened in the conference without hardly any consultation with Republicans. There are just a number of areas where I think They've been strong leadership and certainly sustaining 24 vetoes. That's an indication of Republican cohesion and presidential leadership. Not a single veto has been overturned so far. And so my view is that it's been a good year for the Republicans and President Bush, and we look forward to 1992.
Congress had been expected to adjourn for the year, but it did not. The House Ways and Means Committee will begin hearings next week on various Republican and Democratic proposals to cut taxes. House Speaker Foley said he might call members back in December for a special session on taxes. The Commerce Department today reported a 0.3% drop in consumer spending for the month of October. That's the biggest decline since April. The decline was blamed on sluggish income growth. Robin?
The United States and Britain today demanded that Libya hand over the 2 men charged in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The jet blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland in December 1988, killing 270 people. Investigators have charged that the bombing was carried out by 2 Libyan intelligence agents, Lamin Khalifa Fiman and Abdel Bassed Ali al-Magrahi. The U.S. and British governments also demanded that Libya accept responsibility for the incident, hand over all evidence it has about the case, and pay appropriate compensation. The 2 countries also joined France in demanding that Libya cease terrorist action and sever ties with terrorist groups. Libya has denied involvement in the bombing and refused to hand over the 2 men. It has asked that a neutral body investigate the charges.
Israel asked for a 5-day delay in the next round of Mideast peace talks. State Department spokeswoman Margaret Tutwiler said it was too late to change the date. They are scheduled for December 4th, next Wednesday, in Washington. Israeli officials said they needed more time to prepare. They said they had no plans to go to the talks before December 9th. We have a report narrated by Louise Bates of Worldwide Television News.
The demand to postpone the next round of peace talks came at a defense cabinet meeting. The Israelis were reportedly angry with the U.S. for inviting the Middle East peace negotiators to Washington next month without consulting Israel. Government spokesman Ehud Gol said Israel wants the talks delayed and that Israel will go to Washington for round 2 but wants future talks held in the Middle East.
On December 4th? On December, we suggested December 9th, and that's indeed the date that we'll be going to Washington.
Palestinian representative Hanan Ashrawi implied the Israelis were trying to dictate terms in the peace talks.
Number 2, we feel that this is another way of trying to buy time and trying to procrastinate and evade dealing with issues.
Amid the controversy over Israel's rejection of the American invitation, there were more riots in the occupied Gaza Strip. Palestinians threw stones at Israeli police who tried to stop the unrest in Rafah camp. More police were later drafted in to control the crowd.
Tonight in Washington, the State Department issued a statement saying Syria had joined Lebanon and Jordan in agreeing to the December 4th date for the talks in Washington. A UN-sponsored ceasefire continued to hold in most of Yugoslavia's Croatian Republic, but artillery and mortar shells fell in several eastern Croatian towns. They came from Serb militants in the Serb-dominated Federal Army. Refugees from the fighting jammed the Hungarian border. Officials said today more than 500,000 people have fled Croatia since the fighting began.
The return of a communist Khmer Rouge leader to Cambodia today sparked angry mob violence. 60-year-old Khieu Samphan, the president of the guerrilla group, arrived in Phnom Penh under a United Nations peace plan. He was met by protesters who soon surged through police barricades at his villa. They ransacked the home and beat Samphan, who was inside. He later fled the country. The incident threatened the UN peace treaty that recently ended Cambodia's civil war. We'll have more on this story later in the program.
Chinese officials today denounced a new U.S. trade move against them. U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hill said tariffs worth up to $1.5 billion would be imposed because of Chinese infringement of U.S. patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Chinese trade officials said the move was unfair and does not conform to the interests of both sides. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to bank reform, Gergen and Shields on Wednesday, a Cambodia update, and a Clarence Page essay. At the banks of the United States is where we look first tonight. Monday, a major international group, the OECD, called this country's banking problems a threat to economic recovery. Today, Congress passed a banking bill aimed at doing something about it. We'll have a full discussion after this backgrounder by our business correspondent, Paul Solomon of public station WGBH in Boston. His story is one that goes back to bank laws passed in the 1930s.
For decades, the U.S. protected commercial banks. It kept them out of trouble, but it also kept them from changing with the times. And in these years, the times were changing rapidly. Industry and technology were being transformed. But the commercial banks stood pat. For them, it was business as usual. Take in deposits, loan out the money. Maintain the downtown office buildings, the high overhead of large salaries and expense accounts. In short, it was an industry ripe for challenge from more efficient competitors. And in the 70s and 80s, those competitors sprouted up everywhere. Greenwich, Connecticut's Griffin Ford, for example.
Ford Motor Company has, right now, a very competitive finance rate in order for you to put some money down and finance the car.
Increasingly, companies like Ford displaced the local bank as the place to go for car financing.
Okay, I come into you, I say, I want to buy the Thunderbird, and I want to finance it. What do you do?
I get out a form. I'd get out the Ford Motor Company form.
You're filling out the form even though I haven't asked for it?
Even though you didn't ask me. I'm going to assume it.
Now, I said, wait a second. I already have my own bank. Right. What do I need to finance with you for?
Number one, namely, a created rate from Ford Motor Company.
Lower rate.
Much lower. If I can show you a way where you could save as much as $1,800, $2,500 on the finance charge of the loan, wouldn't you be more interested in doing it with Ford than you would with your local bank?
Well, who wouldn't? By selling cars and loans from the same office, Ford is able to keep its costs low. This enables the company to offer lower interest rates than banks, which is why Ford has become the second largest financial company in the country.
Good afternoon, Sound Beach Financial.
It's not just the automakers who are outcompeting banks for their customers.
Or you go to the other extreme, you could get a one-year adjustable in the low 8s. If you were going to get
when Bart and Karen Snell were looking for a home mortgage, they went to a bank first, then found out about Sound Beach Financial, a company whose only business is offering a wide selection of low-cost home mortgages.
Well, we have less overhead, we have smaller staff, we're fully computerized. We really can tailor and customize a loan to meet our borrowers' needs and give them what they want versus what we have. So, and we do it at a lesser price.
This new competition affected mostly smaller banks, but the larger ones are under siege as well. Their main source of revenue wasn't consumer loans, but jumbo loans to large corporations. Increasingly, however, over the years, large corporations have come to borrow their money here, on Wall Street, using investment banks like Morgan Stanley or Solomon Brothers.
Who borrows here?
The very highest quality companies borrow here. The household name companies. The IBMs, the Fords, the General Motors, the McDonald's, Philip Morris's.
I want Alan on the phone with me tomorrow.
Quite simply, big business switched to investment banks for the same reason people switched to the local Ford dealer. The rates were lower. That's because investment banks can help companies borrow large amounts cheaply by issuing IOUs and selling them to rich individuals and institutions like pension funds through the bond market. Investment banks use modern technology, fewer employees, and can place a big loan more efficiently than a traditional bank. As investment banks, car companies, and mortgage brokers undersold them, commercial banks became increasingly obsolete on the lending side of their business. And they've been losing business on the depositor side as well. Solomon Brothers can help lend out the money of rich depositors like pension funds more efficiently, and other financial firms can do the same thing for small depositors like you and me.
All righty, you have a current balance based on last night's close of $42,134.56.
Fidelity of Boston is a mutual fund company that began by putting customers' money into different funds to buy groups of stocks. More recently, it created mutual funds to invest in groups of mortgages, groups of almost any investment, using modern telephone technology to lure away the traditional bank customer, offering traditional bank services like checking.
The customer is allowed to either buy or sell the fund over the telephone from anywhere in the world, really, with an 800 number at will.
So I can take my money out at any time?
Yes, many of our funds, all of our money market funds, bond funds, offer the privilege of writing a check. So you can simply write a check and use it anywhere you want, just as you would a regular checking account check.
In other words, Fidelity is another kind of bank with lower overhead, fewer buildings, fewer employees. And so it can invest a depositor's money more cheaply and charge the depositor less for the service. Okay, so commercial banks now have competitors eating away at both sides of their business.
And would you just like a check sent to that address? Okay.
Taking away depositors on the one hand, borrowers on the other. Surely the commercial banks noticed this. So how did they try to compete? Well, they did it by looking for loans with higher profit margins to cover their higher expenses. Loans to third world countries, for example, to oil wildcatters, to leverage buyouts, to Donald Trump. Unfortunately, these loans not only brought higher profit margins, they also brought higher risk. These risks have now come home to roost, and commercial banks from Chevy Chase, Maryland to the Chase Manhattan are battling for their lives and blaming their present troubles on the regulations of the past. Chase's Bob Douglas says he'd love to offer customers financial products like mutual funds.
The problem today is not that we don't know how to offer these products. The problem today is that we are restricted in some of the products that we can offer. And because mutual funds can involve securities and the underwriting of securities, we can't offer mutual funds. I mean, that makes about as much. Here we have a distribution system. We have the investment management capability. We already do it for trust customers, but because of this archaic law, we can't compete head-on with Fidelity and some of their products.
Today, our banking system is under stress. There can be no doubt that fundamental reform is needed. The banking system is safe, but it is not as efficient and competitive as it ought to be.
The Bush administration's solution was to free the banks. Let them sell stocks and bonds, sell insurance, operate across state lines. Let other commercial companies buy and operate banks. In short, the administration proposed a form of deregulation that would allow banks to compete with other financial institutions. But the administration's proposal ran up against a wary Congress still paying for the last financial crisis, the S&L mess. And now, 9 months after its unveiling, bank reform seems dead, at least for the moment. Here's how it happened.
You can see down here.
In February, the administration presented its plan for the most sweeping reform in 50 years. In the months that followed, the House Banking Committee, led by Henry Gonzalez, decided to back the plan. But a second House committee, Energy and Commerce, led by John Dingell, balked, fearing that deregulation was the wrong prescription for an ailing industry.
Taxpayers wound up holding the bag on S&Ls. Taxpayers are going to wind up holding the bag on banks. And our problem is to see to it that that does not occur, or if it does occur, it occurs the least.
In late October, the two committee chairmen reached the following compromise. 1, banks would be allowed into the stock and bond business, but with numerous restrictions. 2, interstate banking would be allowed, but 3, commercial companies would not be allowed to purchase banks. It was a compromise that pleased no one. The administration withdrew its support, and earlier this month, the House itself overwhelmingly voted down the plan.
The bill does not pass. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
But Congress couldn't completely dodge the bank problem for one final reason: deposit insurance. Without an infusion of billions of dollars, the fund that insures our banks figures to be broke by the end of this year, if not sooner. So while long-run reform may be on hold, everyone agrees the short-term need for more money just can't be put off.
Today, the banking bill Congress passed put $70 billion in the Deposit Insurance Fund, all of it a loan from the taxpayers. The measure contains no reforms of the banking system. So where does this leave the country's ailing banks, and is the taxpayer at risk for another big bailout? We now have 4 perspectives. Robert Glauber is Undersecretary for Finance at the Treasury Department. Congressman Jim Slattery, a Democrat from Kansas, sits on the House Banking Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committees, which both had jurisdiction over the banking bill. Charles Waterman is chairman and CEO of South Holland Trust and Savings, a bank outside Chicago. He's also chairman of the American Bankers Association's Government Relations Council. He joins us from Chicago. And Edward Kane is a professor of economics and finance at Ohio State University. He joins us from Columbus. Secretary Glauber, as Paul Solman just reported, the insurance fund that insures our deposits is almost broke. Is this $70 billion loan going to cover depositors in the banks that are still likely to go broke?
Well, I think, Robin, that the $70 billion is going to make deposits safe. The problem, I think, is for the taxpayer. Congress had a chance to strengthen the banking system and assure the taxpayer that the banks would pay for their own problems. I think by not passing the kind of reforms that were needed and strengthening the banking system, the taxpayers really have a chance of being left holding the bag.
Okay, now I'm going to come back to the whole reform question in a moment and give you a chance to give us your views on that. But what do you estimate, how long, given the number of banks that are believed in trouble? I read a figure 239 today. Some people think it's more than that. How long is this $70 billion going to last?
Well, the FDIC estimates the $70 billion should be enough. It should get us through the time of problems. Of course, whether it is or not is going to depend a lot on just what happens to the economy, what happens to the real estate markets. We just can't tell for certain because we don't know where the economy is going for certain. But the FDIC's bet is that it will be enough.
Congressman Slattery, how long do you think it'll keep the deposit insurance fund solvent?
Well, Robin, again, I think that Secretary Glauber is hitting the nail right on the head. It depends on what happens to the overall economy. If the price of real estate in this country stabilizes, I think that's very important. And if we don't have a real deep recession, I think that the $70 billion will get the job done.
What's the price of real estate got to do with whether more banks are going to go out of business?
Well, because banks, like savings and loans, and frankly, like a lot of insurance companies, have made a lot of loans that were secured by real estate. And if the value of that real estate starts to drop dramatically, which it has in some parts of the country, then those loans are suddenly no longer secured. And that becomes a very serious problem. That's been the big problem with the savings and loan industry. So that's why it's very important for us to take some action after the first of the year with passive losses, for example, tax laws being changed to help stabilize the price of real estate.
I see. So it's a question mark at the moment in your mind whether this is going to keep the deposit insurance fund secure.
If the economy does not go into a deep recession, if real estate values stabilize, I think the $70 billion will get the job done.
What do you feel, Professor Kane, about the $70 billion?
Well, the $70 billion first has not been tied to a clear and reproducible calculation as to what it is that the FDIC expects in the troubles facing the banking industry. The Office of Management and Budget, in a report at mid-year, calculated that on an economic basis, the fund, the bank insurance fund, was somewhere around $40 billion underwater. That's what we would have to pay, say, a foreign firm to take it off taxpayers' hands. Now, this bill suggests we'll lend $70 billion to the insurance fund, and says that somehow the industry is going to pay back $30 billion of this with excess premiums, and $40 billion is going to come from recoveries of assets in troubled banks. But I don't see how this is not already on the backs of taxpayers, and that all we're really doing is restoring the liquidity of this fund, which is a very important task, but we are not recapitalizing it.
In other words, it's already so much in the hole, in your view, that this just keeps its nose above water. It doesn't bail it out for a while. Is that a fair...
Well, that's right. What we're doing is we're giving it a credit card against which to charge some of the losses that are in the envelope about to be presented over the next year with the bills for funds already spent.
Mr. Waterman is a banker and a representative of the industry. The bank's going to be able to pay this back, or is the taxpayer going to end up bailing out this fund as it's had to do with the S&Ls?
I don't think there's any comparison to the savings and loan situation. What we haven't talked about yet are the strengths in the banking industry, and yes, it's under stress right at the moment, but there's over $200 billion in capital in the banking industry, over $100 billion that has been set aside in reserves.
The industry earned $18 billion last year. 90% of banking institutions such as ours are profitable. 50% such as ours had record earnings in 1990. Is it under stress? Yes, but there are a tremendous amount of strengths out there, and there are limits as to how much the banking industry can pay back. And the FDIC premium assessments now are based on 23 cents per $100, and certainly there are limitations to how much the banking industry can bear. But in the current forecast as projected by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, we see the $70 billion as being adequate. And I point out $40 billion of that is to be repaid from assets that are accumulated by the FDIC and problem bank resolution. So we're talking about amortizing a $30 billion cost actually coming from bank premiums.
Congressman Slattery, let's turn to another aspect of this. As I understand the bill you passed, you've changed something. Up till now, there's been a policy that some banks were just too big to fail, and the government bailed them out, or was willing to bail them out. You've changed that slightly in this bill. Is that correct? And would you explain how you've changed it?
We certainly have, Robin, and I think this is something that's very important for bankers, especially the small banks around the country, to understand, and that is that under existing law, it's a pretty obscure process that's used where the Federal Reserve System consults with the FDIC and perhaps other federal regulators to determine if they're going to prevent a bank from failing because perhaps they can think it's too big to fail. Under the new law, this will require the Treasury, the Federal Reserve System, the FDIC, and even the President to weigh in through the Treasury Department to make a determination as to whether the failure of a particular bank would cause what we have defined as a systemic failure of the system. And that is a much heavier burden. And I believe very strongly that this is going to make it much more difficult to continue to use the too big to fail doctrine to justify keeping a lot of the big banks from going under.
So some big banks will be allowed to fail?
Well, I believe that some of the bigger banks will be allowed to fail if they get into deep trouble. And what this means is that those deposits in excess of $100,000, which is the limit, or the $100,000 for the IRA also, would be then at risk. And that's what this is all about.
Secretary Glauber, what is your comment on this change, and is it a good move?
Oh, I think it's a very good move. It's an important move. I agree with the congressman that what we've done through the law is to treat large banks and small banks essentially the same way, and we should. It just makes no sense to treat small banks differently from the way we treat large banks. Large banks, if they get into trouble, should be allowed to fail. And that's what we're going to do.
So that the kind of scandal there was when regulators allowed the bank in Harlem, for instance, to fail, and everybody said, well, it wouldn't have been allowed to fail if it had been a $2 billion bank instead of a, whatever it was, $40 million bank, that won't happen anymore.
That's exactly correct, Robin. The law is going to prescribe that large banks and small banks should be treated the same. Now, there's one exception. If we have a situation where the entire financial system is at risk, the Fed, the FDIC, and the Secretary of the Treasury can make a finding. But that's going to be the exception. The rule is going to be large and small banks get treated the same way.
Is this a good reform, Mr. Waterman, from a banker's point of view?
Absolutely. I concur with the previous remarks. The only comment I would make is that this was something that the banking industry was unified on from the largest to the smallest bank in the country. The largest and to the smallest bank did not want to have this policy in place of too big to fail. So there was unity among banking in it. We did not want to be treated like a regulated utility. Any institution should be allowed to fail if through mismanagement their equity goes to zero. In your preliminary piece, you talked about the lack of banks' ability to compete because of outdated regulation, and I guess on that I think that was illustrated very clearly. And I'd follow up on Bob Glauber's comments and say I wish that they'd gone past the too big to fail and allowed banks to compete more effectively with additional products and services for a diversified income stream.
That's where I'm going to go now, to Secretary Glauber. Now, the Congress has thrown out all the reforms you wanted that Paul Solman mentioned in his piece. Where does it leave the banking industry now?
Well, I think it leaves the banking industry where it was before, in a weakened state with the difficulty to compete both domestically and internationally, as the piece that Paul Solman did makes pretty clear. What was needed, we believed, and we still believe, is an opportunity for banks to compete, to get strong, and to pay their own way. Our great concern is that if the banks aren't strong enough, not only can't they compete, but they can't pay for the insurance premiums that they're going to have to pay as they borrow the money for their insurance fund from the taxpayer.
Congressman Slattery, why were Democrats like you so hostile to these administration reforms?
Well, that's a very good question, and let me just say that many of us in the Congress do not want to see the banks get involved in the securities industry. And we are protective of the Glass-Steagall Act that was enacted following the stock market crash of the 1920s and 30s.
Explain in very simple terms that I can understand why banks shouldn't sell securities.
Well, I think, Robin, there is an enormous potential for abuse here. And this is the basic question. Should Citibank, for example, be able to loan a company $250 million and then turn around and sell the securities for that company that they just loaned $250 million to? And many of us say absolutely not. And there's enormous room for abuse in this area as far as we're concerned. So we want to keep the securities industry separate from the banking industry. And let me just also observe that there are also some very big conservative Republican bankers in this country that share our view. They don't want to see their fellow bankers get into businesses that they don't believe they fully understand, and thereby put at risk their institutions, and then put at risk the FDIC insurance fund, which is funded by premiums collected from other banks. So there are many banks in this country that don't want to see banks get into businesses that they don't fully understand. And I believe very strongly banks are in trouble in this country, the big banks, because they made terrible and I would say stupid loans to less developed countries. They got involved in doing a lot of ridiculous LBOs, the leveraged buyouts, and funding junk bonds and making some ridiculous loans in the real estate area. They forgot how to do their basic business, and that is to extend credit. And I suggest that the banks in this country need to get back to the ABCs of the banking business, and they'll be a lot better off in the long pull, and so will the taxpayers and the consumers.
Mr. Waterman, why should you be allowed to sell securities with the record that the congressman has just given you of banks in recent years?
Our customers want a diversified portfolio of products. Your piece again pointed out the problems with the earnings in banks, with our competitors coming in and taking those traditional credit applications or the traditional lending roles that Congressman Slattery just talked about away from the banking industry. You need a diversified income stream and a diversified set of products to offer the consumer. Unless you have a diversified income stream and strong earnings in the banking industry, you're not going to have strong capital. If you don't have strong capital, you're not going to have a strong banking industry, and you won't have a strong economy. And I think we're understanding that a solid and strong banking system is inexorably linked to the health of the economy. We are certainly reasonable to have firewalls and reasonable traffic cops in place that will address any concerns that might be had regarding conflicts of interest in engaging in these activities. But I'd illustrate that sometimes they aren't merely serving as a traffic copper's regulations or supervision, but they're absolute roadblocks. Well, let me illustrate. There's an intersection right outside my bank. In 1911, when we were founded, it didn't have any sort of traffic control. Then one stoplight was put in the middle, and now it's a full-fledged intersection with turn lanes. You could make that intersection a lot safer if you'd put up road barriers in all directions and allow a state trooper to only have one car go through every 15 minutes. Those are the kind of roadblocks that a lot of people are talking about. Are we interested in supervision and traffic control to allow the orderly flow of traffic to deliver products and services to our customers? Yes. Are artificial roadblocks the answer that make that intersection absolutely useless? No one benefits by that.
Professor KANE, who's right in this argument? I mean, the banks should be allowed to sell securities, or the Congress that, with the S&L example of deregulation in front of it, is worried about another huge failure?
Well, neither party is really right in the sense of leveling as to what the battle is about. What's keeping the banking industry in trouble in the United States is the large number of insolvent deposit institutions, banks and S&Ls, that are bidding for funds on the one hand and bidding for assets into which to put these funds on the other. And until those wrecked firms are cleared off the street, we're not going to see a strong banking industry. Now, on the other hand, it would help the banks to be able to have a better product line, but they are not completely excluded today. They are able to use holding company arrangements to engage in many of these operations. It's less efficient, and it would be helpful to pass these provisions, but I believe it's very sensible of Congress, on behalf of the taxpayer, to wait to see if we fixed the deposit insurance mess and gotten the erect firms off the street before we open up all these new avenues of taking risks.
Secretary Glauber, as Jim reported at the beginning of this section, the OECD said this week that the banking sector in this country is in its worst crisis since the Depression, and that crisis may be holding back economic recovery because the banks can't or won't lend to stimulate the recovery. If it is that bad, and the situation is that dire, how come you and the Congress are continue to go back and forth on something? I mean, why isn't there a sort of bipartisan commission like there was on Social Security a few years ago, if it is really that extreme and that kind of an emergency? Because the banking system is central to the whole economy and economic confidence.
Well, Robin, it certainly is central, and the weakness in the banking system is making it difficult for banks to make loans, and it is holding back the recovery of the economy. I think the fundamental problem in getting these reforms passed is that banking legislation has always confronted several very strong, powerful, well-financed special interest groups, which manage each time to stalemate legislation. The insurance industry, the securities industry, and the banking industry. They go against each other. They can't get anything passed, but they can veto any legislation, and each time that legislation fails, and each time the cost of that failure goes up. We need to modernize the system, and the OECD is absolutely right.
Is that what it is? Special interests are paralyzing the system, Congressman?
I don't think that that is necessarily the case. Certainly special interest, to use that term. The banks are slugging it out with the securities industry, and the small banks are slugging it out with the big banks, and the banks that are in the securities industry and want to stay there are slugging it out with those that don't want them there. So you have a lot of conflict going on. But I think, Robin, it's very important for us to realize also that some of the broader economic issues affecting the country and the problems that we struggled with in the 1980s, particularly with high interest rates, devastated the banking industry in this country. Lower interest rates now that are at rates that are at a 15-year low almost are going to help the banking industry, I predict, a tremendous amount. The other point that I would make too is that we have reformed this system from a regulatory standpoint with the passage of this legislation, particularly with, for example, the brokered deposits that many people believe were a big part of the problem that we got into, because these were large deposits that went to the highest interest rates that banks were willing to pay all over the country. Now we've restricted those brokered deposits to the institutions that are best capitalized. Well, that's good news.
Let me ask you the question I just asked the Secretary. Is the situation so dire that this calls for some kind of emergency get-together of all the various interests? I use the Social Security funding as an example. It was hailed as the big solution in the 1980s, or is it not so dire and you don't have to worry about it?
Well, I think that if you would ask Bob Glauber, one of his big agenda items right now would be interstate branch banking, and that would probably address about 75% of his concern in this area. And I would just point out that a huge majority of the House, a huge majority of the Senate support that concept, and I think that we can come back next year and perhaps address that with a provision that would enable the states to continue to exercise authority in this area with respect to those larger banks that come into the state and want to do business there. So it isn't going to require a drastic action. I think the key thing is to get an economic growth package together and to keep interest rates down. If we keep interest rates down, the banking industry in this country will do well in the 1990s.
Well, gentlemen, all four of you, we have to move on from there. Thank you for joining us. Jim?
This has not been a terrific 3 days for the image of the government of the United States. The Congress and the President, as reported here and elsewhere, have been exchanging high-pitched insults and accusations, ultimatums and flip-flops over, among other things, who is to blame for the bad economy, crime, and in some cases, as we just heard, not saving the banking system. Even though it is only Wednesday rather than Friday, we brought in our team of Gergen and Shields for some special commentary tonight on this government in action spectacle. David Gergen is editor-at-large of U.S. News and World Report. Mark Shields is a syndicated columnist. Mark, is the government in a frantic free fall, or does it just appear to be that way?
I think the appearance is certainly strong, Jim. I think we're seeing two things. We're seeing, first of all, increasing anxiety on the part of everyone in the country. and most understandably the politicians whose jobs will be hanging in the balance next year, about the economy itself. There's uncertainty. Nancy Cassabon, the senator from Kansas, put it very well, Republican, last week. She said the president's the trumpet player, and when that trumpet sound is uncertain, who will follow? And I think that's what we're seeing, first of all. The second thing is we're on the eve of a presidential election, and you're going to see a lot of charges back and forth, and a lot of people out of nervousness trying to assess blame elsewhere.
But that seems to be all we're seeing, David, is nervousness. Congress blames the president blames, it just goes on and on and on. We've had it the last 3 nights, not as bad tonight. The rhetoric on the banking thing was at a lower decibel than what we heard here last night and the night before, but it's all there.
Well, Jim, I was thinking, you know, you probably, when your kids were young, played a game of Old Maid with them, played the card game of Old Maid, and that's exactly what these last 3 days have been like. It's like a game of Old Maid. Who's going to go home holding the Old Maid? Who's going to go home losing this thing? And so the Democrats are trying to make the Republicans, as Mark say, look like they're blamed for the recession and all the other hard times. And the Republicans faced within their own ranks a strong movement on the part of the conservatives in the House in particular, a feeling that the president was going to bear the blame, Republicans were going to bear the blame, and so they started pushing the last couple of days for this tax cut package.
The Republican package, and they were going to tie it to the SNL thing.
Right. These are the conservatives in the House, and the president's facing a growing rebellion from his conservatives in the House. Pat Buchanan may be announcing for president next week. 82 members of the House sent a letter to the president this weekend. That's half the delegation saying, you need to put Jack Kemp in charge of your domestic policy. The man who ran against you for the presidency now ought to run half your policy, which, of course, the White House didn't appreciate very much. And now the Republican conservatives said, we've got a growth package, we want you to push it. And the White House didn't like the growth package.
Well, they went out and publicly knocked it.
Yeah, they went out and publicly knocked it, but then they got put between a rock and a hard place, in effect, because the Democrats said, okay, Mr. President, what do you feel about your own Republicans? And the White House in the last 24 hours said, well, we guess we better go and buy peace with our conservatives. So they said they were enthusiastic about the bill, but as someone in the White House said to me today, we walked a very fine line. We said we were enthusiastic, but we never said we supported it. Now, if anybody outside the Beltway can understand that distinction.
Okay, so Mark, then it goes to Congress. The Speaker of the House of Representatives says, well, we are not going to, this bill is ludicrous, talking about the Republican, we're going to have anything to do with it unless the President asks us to. And the President says, no, I'm not going to ask you to. Pass it today, but I'm not going to ask you to stay. And then, but then they say, okay, well, we may stay after all. They went home a while ago, but they really didn't go home. What's going on?
Well, I think first of all, Jim, every signal from the administration had been they did not want a tax bill in 1991. From the Secretary of the Treasury to the President's Chief of Staff to the President himself, every signal. I mean, and I'm not talking about subtle signals. I'm talking about direct conversations. We do not want a tax bill this year. They were afraid, scared stiff. One, that they were going to reopen the rich man versus poor man when the Republicans got seared on the capital gains tax cut last year, and they've never recovered from it. The President's score is still about caring about ordinary people. Took a tumble from a positive to a 3-2 negative, and they've never recovered from that. They don't want to revisit that, and they're scared stiff that that would be their central issue. So when the President sends this up, there's anger. There's a sense of that we've been let down, that he's trying to set us up. Most of all, this was felt by Danny Rostenkowski, the President's close friend, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, said, okay, let's go. We'll get a bill. Well, at that point, apoplexy and anxiety seized the White House, and Bob Dole and Secretary Brady and Chief of Staff Sununu all delivered words back channel that they didn't want a vote. So that's where it was left with going home. Just one truth check on my good friend to the left here. During the 87 months of uninterrupted economic growth that became sort of the Republican shibboleth during the 80s, there was never a mention that this was a tribute to the Congress, okay? Yet when the economy goes bad, somehow, all of a sudden, having claimed all the credit for what the economy was doing during these boom years, during the non-salad days of the 90s, oh my God, it turns out to be those Democrats on the Hill.
Well, if they had screwed it up, we might still have a good growth going on.
David, is it fair to say that watching what's been going on here in Washington these last 2 or 3 days, several of the columnists, Anna Quinlan made a comment today in the New York Times, that it seems like it's kind of a bunch of insiders playing an inside game of who's on top, who's to blame, who's whatever, and what's really at issue has been lost.
I think that's absolutely right. And Al Sindlinger, who does overnight survey work out of Media, Pennsylvania, told me this afternoon, he said, you know, what he's getting on his telephone calls overnight is people are confused and they're growing very angry. And what's showing up in his surveys, interestingly enough, during the Carter years when there was a lot of indecision, people felt sorry for Carter because they thought he didn't know any better. With George Bush, because he was so good in the Persian Gulf War, what they're saying is they feel he's arrogant. They're angry at him because they feel he should know better. It's a very striking difference, and I do think that this back and forth is dampening consumer confidence. It's not just a political problem anymore, Jim. I think it's retarding the recovery because people don't have confidence in the way this city is being run.
I think David's absolutely right. I'd add two quick things to it. First of all, George Bush, on this issue, unlike the Persian Gulf, has become the ad-lib president. He ad-libbed on credit card interest rates.
According to Johnson.
According to Johnson. Nobody just kind of tossed it in. It was something that hadn't been discussed, hadn't been debated, hadn't been argued before the American people. He tossed it into a speech. It sent consternation, apoplexy through the markets and everything else. Withdrew it, asked the Speaker of the House to stop it from going through the Congress, which the Speaker did do. Now he ad-libs yesterday in a photo opportunity at the White House for, I don't know what it was. I mean, was it Ringworm Poster Child or something? You know, it was one of those major events at the White House. President, I'm enthusiastically for it. I mean, there's no, in other words, this is such a serious issue that David's right. You should go to the American people. You should sit down and say, this is my policy. This is what I am saying to correct things.
But the Congress doesn't come out looking much better than the President does at the end of this week.
No.
On this Thanksgiving Eve, does he?
The difference is that people never expected very much from the Congress. They've always said these guys are clowns, you know, they're not performing well, so there's more anger directed at the President. But the truth is everybody gets hurt in this process. Now, I think that there's some fallout from this. Mark, I think has some insight on this, but it seems to me coming out, given the state of play, the President has strengthened himself here in the last 24 hours with his right. At least he has bought peace with the conservatives. They feel, in effect, Jim, yes, he's been flip-flopping, but when he flopped this time, he flopped our way.
So that's all that matters. You see, that's the point I was trying to make, though, that the people pick up that only anybody cares about is flip my way or flop the other way.
But the other side of this is, because Congress now is threatening to come back, there are people in the White House who are saying tonight it may be harder to bash them in the next few weeks because Tom Foley now has an issue and Danny Rostenkowski, as Mark says.
So if the President says anything while they're gone, he can just say, well, come on back.
Hard, Mark,
come on back.
So they said he's been snookered by his own Republican right?
I think to some degree that's the case. I think that what the Republican right was concerned about, and Republicans in general, they had nothing to go home with. There really isn't a Bush domestic plan or triumphs or achievements. All they had really were 24 vetoes this sustained. That's a tough thing to argue, even at the Rotary Club, that what I did in Washington was to sustain vetoes.
The White House is trying to put together a serious plan now.
Look, we have to go, and we will continue this on Friday night. Okay, have a nice Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Next, we have an update from Cambodia, where the United Nations is trying to mold the country's warring groups into a government of reconciliation. Just how difficult that will be was made brutally clear today when a key leader of the Khmer Rouge faction, blamed for the death of at least 1 million Cambodians in the 1970s, returned to the capital of Phnom Penh. Lindsay Taylor of Independent Television News has been reporting from Cambodia and prepared this report on today's outbreak of anger and violence and what it means for peacemaking.
A smiling Khieu Samphan arriving at Phnom Penh airport this morning. The acceptable face of the Khmer Rouge, not to the people of Phnom Penh. Returning for the first time in almost 13 years, Khieu Samphan dismissed fears for his safety, saying he was happy to be back and intended to remain for the rest of his life. But the Khmer Rouge, which had seen the quiet return of another leader 10 days ago, this time underestimated the reaction of the people. It began with demonstrations, at first non-violent, denouncing the return of the man Cambodians see as a murderer. As the protesters lined the convoy's route, increasingly memories turned to the past. The man before them was the same one who 15 years ago had helped preside over the years of genocide. Right-hand man to Pol Pot, who emptied Phnom Penh of its people, dispatching hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, to the killing fields. Such memories were high on the minds of the hundreds who surrounded the Khmer Rouge villa in which Khieu Sampan was resting. It's virtually impossible to find anyone in Phnom Penh who's not lost relatives at the hands of the Khmer Rouge. They killed my husband and my children, this woman said. Give me back my husband and my children, said another. As the crowd grew angrier, they pushed past police and tore down the fence. They stormed the house. What was found inside was tossed out. Much of it was ritually set on fire. Inside, Khieu Sampan, cowering out of sight in a room, was surrounded and set upon. With only government soldiers to protect him, Khieu Sampan pleaded with Western photographers not to leave him.
He was surrounded, the room was full with 20 or 30 people, and the police were covering him with their bodies. But the crowd was there for at least 1 hour in the same room, beating Khieu Sampan over the head, as well as to the body. He was cowering on the floor. He was surrounded by police, basically, that saved his life. Otherwise, he would have been killed.
As government forces appealed for calm, the country's Prime Minister, Hun Sen, was said to have contacted Khieu Sampan by radio to ask him if he wanted to leave Cambodia. At first he resisted, then, some 5 hours later, Khieu Sampan crawled unceremoniously to the protection of an armoured vehicle. He was then taken to the airport and flown out to Bangkok. Today's events will dismay the United Nations, which is due to supervise the handover to multi-party elections in Cambodia. But they were no surprise to Prime Minister Hun Sen, who told us of his fears earlier this month.
My concern now is how we can protect the Khmer Rouge. It is said that there might be demonstrations against them in Phnom Penh, and if we don't protect them, they will not be safe. But if we use our police to stop the demonstrations, we shall be accused of violating human rights.
I think it's fairly clear that Hun Sen would have been pleased to see the demonstrations start and make it clear to the Khmer Rouge that there is popular feeling that's very much hostile to them. But I think it's also clear that this demonstration got out of hand very quickly, because it has put the peace process at some risk, and that is not something that Hun Sen wants.
First sign of that threat to the peace settlement came tonight, with Western diplomats saying next week's opening meeting of Cambodia's Supreme National Council, which includes the Khmer Rouge, has been cancelled. The fear is that although the Khmer Rouge have been seen off from Phnom Penh, they may now have been given the excuse to resume their fight from the jungle.
Finally tonight, some thoughts about a museum in Memphis. They are those of essayist Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune.
It may be the least likely place for a museum that anyone ever imagined. But for some, like civil rights movement activist DeArmie Bailey, the old Lorraine Motel has been a crumbling shrine ever since Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated here in 1968.
People come from all over the world to pay tribute to the memory of Dr. King, who gave his life fighting here in this city, who breathed his last breath here on this balcony of this motel. And we thought that we had a responsibility to transform this site into a facility that could teach future generations about what this struggle was all about, that it's not just a place to come and look in awe at, oh, that's where Dr. King fell. But it's a place to come and understand why he fell. It's a place to come and understand what the assassination meant. It's a place to come and understand that even though that was the assassination of a great man, that movement, that spirit lives on.
After King's murder, the motel fell on hard times, including drugs and prostitution, an embarrassment to Dr. King's memory. Bailey, now a Memphis judge, and other movement veterans raised money to buy the motel. 10 years and $8.8 million later, the National Civil Rights Museum has just opened, keeping great events of the past alive with the stagecraft of the future. Walk up to the door of Little Rock High School, press a button, and hear the arguments that outlawed racial segregation in public schools.
This morning, the mob again gathered in front of the Central High School of Little Rock, obviously for the purpose of again preventing the carrying out of the court's order relating to the admission of Negro children to that school.
Sit down at a whites-only lunch counter with students who risk life and limb just to get a cup of coffee. Face the teeth of police dogs and fire hoses Bull Connor unleashed on peaceful protesters in Birmingham. This is history for the generation that's grown up on Sesame Street, computer games, and Disney World. For the rest of us, it's memories. Uncomfortable memories came to mind as I walked aboard an authentic Montgomery, Alabama bus provided by the makers of the Whoopi Goldberg movie, The Long Walk Home. You can walk inside now, sit down with Rosa Parks, and be yelled at by the bus driver, just like she was.
If you don't move out of that seat, I'll have you arrested. Get up from there!
Sitting here reminds me of my own trips aboard similar buses during visits as a child down south with my parents, who left Alabama only to find more racism in the North, subtle prejudice that sometimes made them long for the frankness of the South. If the movement generation romanticizes the victories of the civil rights era, it is because its results look so much better than what came before it, and its clarity of vision and purpose looks so much better than what has come later. If anything is celebrated here, it is the power of a good idea, developed in places like Birmingham Jail, where Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter, Why We March. Hardened in the crucible of gas and billy clubs in Selma, Alabama, in the fires of a burning freedom bus, or the rich textures of the March on Washington. A good idea can move millions of all races, creeds, and colors.
We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote.
And if anything is disparaged here, it is the folly of a bad idea, or a badly unfinished idea. Black power was shouted spontaneously and ambiguously in this 1966 march. It emerged as a slogan without an agenda and eventually tore the movement apart. It is sobering to reflect on how far we've come since then and how far we have yet to go. One wonders, for example, if the color line has been erased or if it's only been replaced. If this museum has a central theme, it is this: the struggle for human rights did not begin with Dr. King, and it didn't end with his death. The clarity of his vision moved hearts around the world, from Tiananmen Square to the Berlin Wall, and is captured in this bronze sculpture, the first thing visitors see in the museum's lobby. It is a mountain, or perhaps a wall, covered with a diversity of people. Some help each other, some try to make it alone. All are engaged in different ways in the same struggle to overcome. To an age complicated by moral ambiguity surrounding race, it reminds me of the vision of common purpose Americans once shared. Maybe someday we'll find it again. I'm Clarence Page.
Again, the major stories of this Thanksgiving Eve. Congress headed home for the holiday after passing bills to spend money on transportation, the bank and SL insurance funds, Soviet aid, and assistance for U.S. farmers, among other things. The United States and Britain demanded Libya hand over 2 suspects on the bombing of Pan Am 103. And U.S. officials said the next round of Middle East peace talks will go ahead next week in Washington, despite Israel's request for a delay. Lebanon and Jordan have already agreed to come. Tonight, the State Department announced Syria and the Palestinians have also accepted. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the News Hour tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, Thanksgiving Day, with a look at how multiculturalism is making American schools reevaluate the way they teach history. Enjoy your holiday. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour since 1983 because quality information and quality communication is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. and by PepsiCo, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the financial support of viewers like you. Video cassettes of the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1. This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And the Iowa broadcast is made possible by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Enjoy more TV worth watching in 1/2 hour.
That's the question that we have to explore, really. Do I hate my brother because he reminds me of myself? Or do I hate my brother because he reminds me of someone who is not myself? So whom do I hate? The one who is me, or the one who is anything but me?
I'm Bill Moyers. Join me for Facing Hate, a conversation with Elie Wiesel.
See this special program this evening at 7.
The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of other things, and we're going to talk of them in Alaska, where the wildlife flourished till Russian hunters moved in, and in California, where the first settlers found paradise and replaced it. This is George Page. Join me for the breathtaking beauty of our final frontiers and land of the eagle, a nature special presentation.
And continue our look at Iowa tonight at 8.
You're